Hi, my name is Jennifer Shivers, and in this section we will cover syntactic standards, and we will discuss the steps to determine the syntactic standards that are needed for a particular use case. There are all types of standards used to support computer systems. OpenHIE focuses on two main types of standards. The first is semantic or terminology standards that focus on standardizing the meaning of health-related terms. The second is syntactic standards that are about the format of the message or the sentence structure of the data that is exchanged between different health information components. For example, a client registry may need to share registration or get registration information with a point of care system like an EMR. In this section, we will focus on syntactic standards. Terminology standards cannot stand alone. There is a need to specify the format and order of the medical terms or medical concepts that are being exchanged between computer systems. The syntactic or messaging standards define the structure and content of the data that can be exchanged between systems. OpenHIE works with standards organizations like HL7, which stands for Health Level 7, and IHE, Integrating the Healthcare Enterprise, to ensure that the underlying standards meet the requirements for health data exchanges that need to be supported. So OpenHIE builds its standards upon IHE profiles, which are also built upon HL7 or FHIR standards. So you could think of it as a pyramid with the OpenHIE specification at the top. In OpenHIE, we start with the data exchange needs in specific contexts, and then the OpenHIE architecture community either finds or develops patterns for those data exchanges. The data exchanges are applied back into the context, and then the implementation informs the community's thoughts and patterns. It's a circle of standards development based upon real-world needs and implementation experience. For this work, we need to hear from implementers concerning gaps in their experiences from implementing standards. OpenHIE is a community approach to creating the patterns for e-health information architecture and data exchange. We do that by having sub-communities that regularly meet to discuss the business challenges related to specific parts of the architecture. In addition, we have an architecture community which serves to make sure that the individual components work together and that the standards needed for sharing information between the components are in place or created. The architecture specification is expected to evolve over time, but includes the following components: the high-level architecture diagram, which specifies the components, the patterns and standards for data exchange between components, which we will discuss in this module. I've already shown you this diagram where we talked about OpenHIE standards and the architecture specification being built on IHE profiles. Let's take a little deeper dive into IHE profiles and HL7 and FHIR standards. As I mentioned previously, IHE stands for Integrating the Healthcare Enterprise. It's a global organization where contributors, like many of our OpenHIE colleagues, work toward defining how FHIR and other standards are applied to specific use cases. The OpenHIE team listens for gaps in the implementation needs or experiences and either identifies an existing IHE protocol that can be used to support that data exchange or works through IHE to appropriately define a new specification. The OpenHIE community works in various IHE committees to ensure that there are defined ways for data exchanges to meet OpenHIE and health information exchange needs. These are examples of the IHE profiles that OpenHIE standards reference. For example, the OpenHIE architecture specification denotes a workflow or a data exchange for aggregate data. That data exchange is based upon the IHE ADX and MADX profiles. The MADX specifies that it is a FHIR profile. These profiles and links to the detailed specification will be noted in the OpenHIE specification. For a full list of the standards that OpenHIE is recommending and supporting, see the OpenHIE architecture specification and the wiki page that I have noted on this slide. Many of these data exchange standards are based upon FHIR, and many are based upon other versions of HL7. I will provide a high-level overview of the components of FHIR that are most important to technical implementers. Note that your OpenHIE teammates are working with FHIR to make sure that the FHIR constructs support the definitions and attributes needed to support health information exchange. One of the major concepts in FHIR is that there are specific types of resources that are used by health data. I invite you to pause this video in a moment and Google and look for FHIR resources. So if you search for FHIR resources, you should be able to pull up the page that I am looking at on this slide. FHIR resources are the data packages used to send or receive data in a FHIR compliant data exchange message. I invite you to pause now and look at the resources list. As you were exploring the FHIR resources, I hope that you clicked on one of them and looked further at the example. In health data, one of the most common resources is the patient resource. I provide this as an example so that you can see how the attributes and data types are defined for each FHIR resource. I encourage you to stop the video and pull up the resources page and take a more in-depth look at the patient resource and any other FHIR resources that you're interested in before you start the video again. The FHIR resources are great, but they are not enough to specify a data exchange. There is a registry of FHIR implementation guides. These implementation guides define how the FHIR resources are used in specific data exchanges. WHO and others are currently defining implementation guides that specify the resources needed to support sexually transmitted infections, HIV, and other health-specific challenges. And in a moment, I'll encourage you to stop your video and take a moment to look at the implementation guide reference. You can find it by searching for FHIR Implementation Guide Registry. Please look now. As we try to put some of these message or syntax standards together, we see how OpenHIE works with these base standards. Finally, let's talk about how you can determine the syntactic standards that fit the needs for your use case. Number one, once you have identified your use case and the architecture components that are needed to support that use case, I'd suggest sketching out the data that needs to move between the architecture components. Once you have that sketch, you can use the OpenHIE architecture specification to identify the data exchanges or workflows that support your needs. Number two, in the specification, you should be able to look at the table of contents that I have provided on the right side of the screen as an example. Look at that table of contents and you should see the workflow section. The workflows are the data exchanges. The workflows are intentionally named in ways that help you identify the type of information that should be moving between components. Most of these are very specific and you should be able to easily identify which one applies to your particular use case. Those data exchanges will specify the IHE profiles, which in turn specify FHIR implementation guides or HL7 standards. What if you can't find what you need? So what if OpenHIE doesn't cover the data exchange that you're trying to implement? Please contact the OpenHIE architecture community via Discourse or via the OpenHIE wiki or any other method, and we will either help you find the applicable standard or work with the standards organizations to make sure that we define one. This concludes this section of the course. You may now proceed to the next section, which is the quiz.